Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another wonderful episode of Writers Chat. We are so glad you're with us, whether you're here with us participating while we're doing the recording or whether you are watching the replay. We're very, very glad that you do that. My name is Johnny Alexander, and I am joined by my co-hosts, Brandy Bro and Norma Poor, and our very special guest. And Norma is going to introduce her for us today.
Edwina, thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce you today. I first met you at Blue Ridge Christian Writers Conference, gosh, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And I went all alone, and you were one of the first celebrity people I met. And you just made me feel so relaxed and comfortable and checked on me throughout the conference. And then I've run into you at subsequent conferences, and you remember me, and you're such a kind encourager. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about Edwina. She is the Assistant Director of the Blue Ridge Mountains Christian Writers Conference, and she's also the coordinator of Mentoring Moments and manager for the Sensitivity Between the Lines, which are both part of the Blue Ridge. They come under the umbrella of the Blue Ridge Writers Conference. She's an acquisitions editor for Iron Stream Media and for the imprint Harambe. Did I say that right?
Harambe.
Harambe Press. Harambe Press. And she's been a longtime member of Word Weavers International, and she now serves as a member of the advisory board. Edwina is an award-winning writer, experienced teacher, speaker, freelance editor, and a sensitivity reader. She is also a freelance writer for Guidepost. So be sure to check her out on Guidepost, y'all. One of her passions is to address the need for sensitivity and diversity in publishing, in the publishing industry. And she is a lover of dark chocolate. And if y'all really want to bribe her, bring chocolate covered espresso beans. So Edwina, we'd love to hear what you have to share with us today.
Well, first I want to say thank you for having me. I am so honored that you asked me. I love talking to authors, writers, and more than anything, when someone says, "Are you willing to talk about diversity and sensitivity?" I just light up. I am so excited that people want to hear more about this. And until we start talking, change is not going to happen, because you have to talk before you have change. I love this quote by a lady called Katie Waldman. She said, "As a push for diversity in fiction reshapes the publishing landscape, the emergence of sensitivity readers seems almost inevitable." Now, when I started years ago being a sensitivity reader without knowing what it was called, I started looking it up on Google, and you couldn't find it anywhere. There was just a splattering of people who were willing to read diversity in manuscripts. And now, if you type in sensitivity reader, you get hundreds of tags, people who are saying, "I'll do this for you." And something about that excites me, and something about that concerns me, because you want someone who really knows what they're doing to be a sensitivity reader. I want to give you some necessary facts before we go into more about what is a sensitivity reader, what do they do. Most people don't know this, but in 2018, there were more children's books about animals and non-human characters than all types of visible minorities combined. 27% dealt with non-human characters, and only 23% dealt with minorities. Yet, meanwhile, half of all the children's books all the children's books featured white children. Now, I don't know how many of you know this or not, but as of the 2020 census, we have now become a country of, let me say this correctly, minority majority. Now think about that. Minority majority. So our books need to reflect what this is, not only for children, but for adults as well. Children want to know what they, look like in writing. They want to see themselves. I remember I homeschooled for 19 years. Yes, I was crazy enough to do that. And one of the things that I really looked for was books that represented my kids. And yet at the same time, I couldn't find them. And it kind of broke my heart, because I was like, I want them to see themselves. And so now when I look at my grandchildren, there are all kinds of books out there for them. That just does my heart good. So I wanted you to know a little bit about where all of this is starting to come from. And we all know what happened to George Floyd. And that, I think, just accelerated the need for sensitivities and diversity in manuscripts. Publishing houses now are saying they want diversity in their manuscripts, but they're not telling people how to do it. And I don't want authors to go, oh, I have to do this because it's the trend. You have to do it because you're called. Just like you write because you're called. You can't write diversity unless you're called to do so. And in order to talk about a culture outside of your own, you need a sensitivity reader. And I want to say this up front: sensitivity isn't race only. It's not a black and white issue. It's anybody in a marginalized community. If you're writing about somebody who, is in a wheelchair and you've never experienced that, you need a sensitivity reader. Anytime you're writing outside of a culture of your own, you need that sensitivity reader. So here's what I want to talk about. What exactly do they do? Are they paid? And are there suggestions that writers can use to help them write when they're writing about diversity? Now, sensitivity readers, they're individuals who are from a specific community that you're writing about, and their goal is to help you with your blind spots in manuscripts. They're not there to police your manuscript. They're there to help your manuscript to be as strong as it can be. And those of us who are sensitivity readers, the whole thing is we're lending our expertise to areas where we can verify for authenticity and accuracy in your writing. We're not editors, although some of us are. Our goal isn't to edit your manuscript. It's to look for those areas. Now, I have to admit, as an editor, I often will want to go in and edit, but I have to tell myself, you're reading for sensitivity. And so I read for that. I read for misrepresentations. I read for the stereotypes, lack of understanding, because the whole idea is, like I said earlier, to help a writer be as best as they can with getting their story across. Wouldn't it be awful if you spent all this time writing your manuscript and feeling you've got a story to get out, and you make one small mistake about a marginalized community? Well, a couple of things are going to happen. That book is probably not going to do well, because the people from that community aren't basically going to endorse it. If anything, they're going to encourage their friends not to read it because they look at it as not being authentic. And that's why you need the sensitivity reader. Those of us who are sensitivity readers, we are inviting you into our community. It's more than just, on paper relationship. We're saying that we're willing to be vulnerable enough to allow you inside. And we're also saying to you, we hope that you'll listen to what we have to say. But as the writer, you have the ultimate say-so. It's just, we want you to consider what we have to say. Don't expect a sensitivity reader to have all the answers, because we don't. When I first started talking about sensitivity, I had people with manuscripts from all over the place. I had this one person who came to me, and I was interested in the story. However, I couldn't speak to, I think it was 1500 writing, a person who was African American, but had a very, I think they were in the military, and it was a guy. And I went, one, I don't know that era. Two, I don't know military. And three, if I'm going to read sensitivity for a guy, it needs to be more current. I also have people who've asked me to read on all kinds of slavery. Well, I do a good job with that because I grew up in the South. I remember my heritage. I remember stories that my great uncle told me. But if you ask me to read for someone who grew up in the city of New York, who, may have even grown up on the streets, or who knows, I can't read specifically for city. So realize that your one sensitivity reader doesn't know everything. And I always emphasize, if you get a sensitivity reader, also consider a number of beta readers. The idea is your sensitivity reader is going to go probably deep for you, and you can use them at any time. You can use them at the beginning of a story. You can use a sensitivity reader for a section of a story. But at the same time, you need those other readers who are different ages, but understand your writing. And that's why a sensitivity reader is paid, because you're paying for their expertise. You're paying for their time. And, I always get the question, what do they charge? And that really varies. I was looking at some things because under Blue Ridge, we have a specific amount that we charge. But if you want to get an idea, imagine you've got a 60,000 word manuscript. You're going to pay a good sensitivity reader between probably $550 and $700, depending on what they're doing. And you may go, oh my gosh, that's a lot. Actually, it's kind of a bargain. And because you're going to go back and forth, a sensitivity reader not only impacts your writing, they impact the way you see the world. They impact the way you see their community. And so it's not just like editing, but it's like, this is, I'll give you an example. Someone used the word thug. And I didn't have to keep reading. I said, this, without knowing anything else, you're referring to an African-American individual, aren't you? And the person was like, how did you know that? I said, because it's a stereotype. It's the way you set it up. And I want you to consider something else. Or another thing to consider when you're doing stereotypes, don't. I gave someone an idea who had a drug dealer in their story, and it was, he was on the corner, he, had a gold tooth, he had different things. And I said, what if your drug dealer was a doctor who had access to the drugs? The outcome is still the same, what you're trying to do. Or what if another situation with drug dealers, and I said, if you want the young kids to look up to this person, he's not going to look like he's falling apart. He's going to have a Rolex. He's going to have a suit. He's going to look sharp. So these young kids who have nothing will want that. So that's where you have to change your thinking a little bit. The idea is, what is the outcome? And can you do it without using a stereotype? Here's a little one that some of you may not have ever considered. If you refer to someone on the south side of the tracks or the south side of town, do you think of wealth? Or do you think more toward poverty? So I'd love seeing some of the heads go, mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing. What if the area that you're talking about is on the west side or even on the east side? The descriptions that you give in your writing, we know what you're talking about without stepping into that area of being stereotyped. So that's, and I know I'm sharing a lot, but I want you to understand that's some of what we do and some of what I personally love to do. I've told people before, you can't say anything to me that I will be offended about. You can't. Because if you want to understand and you want to learn and you want to grow, then my place is to help you. Some people won't share, but I just don't want to offend you. I'm like, you won't. You're in a learning position. And if God's given me the ability, I'm in a teaching position. And the sensitivity readers that I work with, they don't get offended. They want you to be open. They want you to be honest. And you work as a team. It's just like when you work with an editor, you want to work with someone that you're comfortable with. You want to work with somebody that you trust who will give you the feedback you need. And it's the same with the sensitivity reader. If you enter that relationship and you have any questions whatsoever, then you guys need to part ways, because if you don't trust your reader, you're not going to accept their input. So you have to have that relationship. I think I've said we don't have all the answers. And at the same time, because we're not editors, we're not looking for mistakes in your manuscript. We're not looking to see if your manuscript flows. We're looking to see how those characters in your manuscript are portrayed. Now, I will occasionally, when I do a sensitivity read, will go through the parts that are sensitivity. And then at the end, I'll say, just for your consideration, this is not a sensitivity response. However, because like I said, that's the editor in me. Not everybody will do that, but I feel like if I'm going to help your work be stronger and I can give you those little tips, I won't correct them, but I'll give you those little tips to help you move forward. When you work with a sensitivity reader, you have to be open-minded and willing to learn. And it is an emotional labor. I call it an act of love to be in this process, because there are times when nothing against the author or the writer, but it breaks my heart. There's no judgment, but it breaks my heart that that's what you've believed all this time, or that's what you've been exposed to. I have to tell the story of my daughter-in-law's father. He is a pastor. I mean, and he is a pastor. He's white. He's in Mississippi in the Delta area. And he felt like God called him back for ministry of reconciliation. Now, he's white, which means his daughter is white. This is not white, which means my son is not white. So when they started dating, and I could just tell, I knew where this was going. They're both missionary kids. They both love the Lord. And when she said she was from Mississippi, now here's my prejudice. I was like, Mississippi? And when my husband and I were going there for the wedding, we crossed the border. He shook his head and he said, I never knew I would intentionally drive into Mississippi. Now, that is because of the history that's happened in that state. So as we got to the wedding, we love our in-laws. I mean, they're just wonderful people. And we were talking to the dad, and he just kind of chuckled and he said, God brought me, he laid on my heart that I'm going to have a ministry of reconciliation, but I never knew it would start with my own family. Think about that. I never knew it would start with my own family. And he embraced my son. He has embraced us. But when he first got to Mississippi and felt like this is what God wanted him to do, he was committed to walk the entire town. Now realize this is a tiny town, and pray every day. The entire town. Well, some of the ladies in the church found out what he was doing, and they said, we'll walk with you. But they got to the railroad tracks and stopped. And he looked at them and he said, well, what are you doing? And one of the ladies said, my husband told me I should never cross the tracks because I could get killed. And he just looked at them. He said, well, my God told me to pray for the whole town. So if you want to stay there till I get back. So he continued to do this. And after about a week where they would stop at the tracks and he would keep going, he was coming around a neighborhood and he noticed these women who weren't willing to cross the tracks were standing in the middle of the road with the African-American women who lived in that community, and every other one, black, white, they're holding hands and they're praying. And that's what we're about when you're willing to work with the sensitivity reader and we're willing to allow you to come into our world. We're breaking down those barriers and we're trusting God to get our words out, to do what you've called us to do. And sometimes it's hard to cross that. So other thing, realize, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, not every sensitivity reader is going to accept your project. They know their limitations. And though you may be an excellent reader, there are projects I've had to turn down, or excellent writer. There are projects I've had to turn down. I had to turn down one recently and I loved the story, but I knew I couldn't do it justice. And so because I work with other readers, I reached out to somebody else and said, this sounds like something that would fit you. She was so excited. She's like, not only does it fit, I've already done a sensitivity read on this project before, one that's similar, same time period. And I went, see, I knew it wasn't for me. I couldn't do it justice. So the main thing that you also need to know is you have to be honest with yourself. There's some things to consider if you're writing about a marginalized community. Have you ever read books about authors from that community? I don't mean read books that were written, about that community by someone who doesn't live in it, but actual authors who are a part of the community that you're writing about. That's so important. And I always say, not sure what that was, but I always say, Google is not your God. Please hear that. Google is not your God. Google can give you a lot of information, but they're not 100% accurate. You need to, and I mean, immerse yourself in the community, which means read about writers who are from, or read books by writers from that community. Now, Google can point you into directions where you can meet people from that community. And even Facebook can bring you closer, but you do everything in your power to have face-to-face or interact with people from that community. I would tell people quite often when they're writing about African Americans and they've not really been exposed, I will say, you need to go to a Black church. They're like, what? I said, not only a Black church, I want you to go to a Black charismatic church, because people will be real in church. And the things that you hear and that you say or see will make you uncomfortable. And right now it needs to. If you want to understand more about the Black community, the church is a place to go. If you're writing about African American youth or any youth of a different ethnicity, go to a basketball court, listen to them interact with each other. Because one of the things that I need you to realize is, as people in the ethnic community, we've learned to live in two worlds. We've learned to live in our world, and we've learned to live in yours if you're white. And so we already know how to speak two languages. I went to a conference one time. This is one of my favorite stories, so get ready. It was for ethnic writers. Now, this doesn't happen too often, but I had gone to Publishing in Color, and we're on a lunch break, and I'm sitting there listening to the ladies at the table next to me. And this is kind of how it went. And I'm not making fun, but this is how it went. One lady said, "Girl, I don't know why they have to mess up macaroni and cheese. I mean, macaroni and cheese is macaroni, cheese, milk, salt, pepper. Who came up with the idea of putting breadcrumbs on it, putting all this stuff in it?" And the lady next to her said, "Mm-hmm." And I mean, they went on, and I'm sitting there just dying laughing, because I understood that. I kind of grew up with that. But had we been in a white conference, it would have been, "I'm not used to macaroni and cheese like this." "Yeah, me either. Do you put breadcrumbs on top of your macaroni and cheese?" "No, I normally don't." But they knew in that moment, they knew they were in community. And if that's what you're looking to find out about, then immerse yourself, and you will. I'm not expecting you to feel comfortable the first time or second time or even the 10th time. You're gonna feel uncomfortable, but it's something that you really need to do if you're going to write about that community. I had another author that I was working with, and I had encouraged her to do this because her writing was not reflecting the community she wanted to write about. She chose to stop writing for a while, got involved with this African American critique group online. Another way, she got involved with an African American critique group online and was a part of that group for probably 6 months before they started inviting her to outings. They invited her to church. They invited her to different things. And she got to immerse herself in the community just from these writers. And she came back and said, "I think I understand now what you were saying." Case in point. And it still makes me tear up sometimes because she was willing to go where it was uncomfortable. What else? Like I said, I can keep going. Okay, so I mentioned that you need to pay them. The other thing with a sensitivity reader is they love to read. And that's going to benefit you greatly. They love to read, and you need to find out if they read in your genre. Now, they can read across the line for a lot of things, but like if someone asked me to do a sensitivity read with fantasy, I don't read fantasy. I would find it fascinating, but if you're trying to see if you're making a distinction with your ethnic fairies, I hate to word it that way, but I don't know. But somebody who reads fantasy may go, "Okay, here's some things that you can do." So that's what's important. You need to make sure they read what you write. So you might be asking, So what are the qualifications of a sensitivity reader? What should you be looking for? And because now, like I said, you go online and there's hundreds of people who say, I'm a sensitivity reader, send it to me. You need to have somebody who is familiar with the publishing industry. That's really important. You need to have someone who's done some type of editing. You basically need to ask them questions. Don't just assume that because they're of a specific ethnic group that they're going to have all the answers you're looking for. So ask them basic, communication skills. How many books have you been a sensitivity reader for? Can I reach out to one of the authors? Can you, do you have any feedback that you've gotten from them? Questions almost like you would ask an editor that you've never worked with before. You can even ask, how and why did you decide to be a sensitivity reader? Things like that. And the other thing that I like to encourage is I ask sensitivity readers to do a sample read, which means you pull something from your writing that you think needs some work and see the feedback they give you. And then you can decide, do I really, do I feel like this is going to work for me or not? So don't blindly jump into it. And if they're not willing basically to answer your questions or to, and ask them, could you give me a sample of what you do? If I send you a small portion, maybe a page of my manuscript. If they give you pushback on that, you need to reconsider if you really want to work with this person. And the other way is ask around to people who've used it. Yes, this is going to be a little bit of a shameless promotion, but I have a sensitivity team through Blue Ridge. And if you go to the Blue Ridge website, Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference, there's a section that says sensitivity readers, and it tells you how to get a hold of me. And I can send you information about, what you can expect. And the main thing that I ask writers is, writers, what are you looking for? Because if you want me to read and you want feedback about what they wear, and I'm not looking at that, I won't know. So that's why it's a very kind of short but detailed questionnaire that I have writers fill out so that I can help connect them with readers. The other thing is that I pray about writers and readers and how to connect them, because I feel like God has that person out there for you who will partner with you and help you. So I mentioned that they get paid, and some people ask, well, does the publishing industry, heed what these sensitivity readers do? And the answer is yes, they do, because they know the importance of getting it right. I have agents now who will send their writers to me and say, the writers will say, so this person represents me, and because I have ethnicity in my writing, they thought I should talk to you. I appreciate that, because the agents and the editors see the need, and they're helping their writers to get it right. So again, sensitivity readers, we don't censor. The whole idea isn't censorship. The whole idea is to make your writing as best as it can. Now, here's one that a lot of people ask me, well, as a white writer, how do I write about ethnic characters? I'm going to give you 7 tips. This isn't to replace sensitivity readers, but it is to give you tips if that's what you feel like God is calling you to do, is write about ethnic characters. First tip, you have to research, and do it before you start. If you have halfway or finished a manuscript, and then you want a sensitivity reader, you might find it's just like in editing, you're making the same error over and over and over. So research before you start. That will save you a lot of grief. Edward Deming said, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And you don't want to be just another person with an opinion. So research before you start. The second tip I can give you is describe and carefully name your characters. You need to describe and carefully name your characters. I give the example, you wouldn't name a young lady from Cuba Buffy. It's funny. It makes your characters become comical. You wouldn't name a tough policeman who is not only physically tough, but mentally he's sharp. You wouldn't name him Leprechaun because no one would take him seriously. So describe and carefully name your characters. It has to fit the time period. In 1940s, you're not going to call a girl Tyler. It just doesn't fit. But you get into the 90s and you start calling girls Tyler. So describe and carefully name your characters. Number 3 is skin tone. Please, please, please do not describe skin tone with food. I don't want toffee. I don't want caramel. I don't want mocha, but they're really good in my coffee. So don't use food to describe skin tone. And the other thing I really say, if at all possible, don't flat out name your character, their ethnicity. The Black man walked into the room. The Latino student entered the classroom. Show, don't tell. There's ways you can show it. His angry, okay, I'm making this up on the fly. He raised his angry, dark brown eyes just a shade lighter than his skin tone. What color is this person? He's a dark brown. Use shades of brown, use comparison, but try not to use food. And if at all possible, try not to just flat out say they're Black, they're Latino, they're Indian, anything like that. They're Asian. Use your descriptions. It makes your writing so much stronger. The fourth thing that I would encourage you to do is representation is very, very important. You need to represent well, bring in things that represent that culture. I explain to people quite often, have you ever heard the term Juneteenth? Well, now that it's a holiday, people are going, what is it? And to sum it up, it's when troops marched into Texas 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was declared and freed the last slaves. And it happened on June 19th, Juneteenth. And that's why the African-American culture celebrates this, because that really was the moment of actual freedom for that time. I loved working with another writer who, when discovering Juneteenth and said to me, I've never heard of it, started researching, and in his middle grade book made reference to it and did it in such a way that it wasn't just dropped in. He did it in such a way where the white characters in the book were like, well, what is this? And the young African-American girl was like, you need to look it up because it had a whole lot to do with my freedom. Isn't that a beautiful way? But when I think of how many people he has introduced that term to and what it means. So when I say representation is important, bring in the culture. You can't write about another community if you're not going to write something about their culture, even if it's one sentence, even if it's a quick statement about it. I've mentioned this before. Read, read, read. You know, in scripture, when something's said 3 times, it's very important. Okay, I'm gonna say it 6 times. Read, read, read. You have got to read in order for this, for your writing to have what it needs. There's a website called diversebooks.org. Again, diversebooks.org. And it has a lot of different ethnic books for you to read. A lot of it's children, but what better place to get started? Number 6, never include a character because it's what's selling. Never do that. Don't include them because it's what's selling. Don't include them because you think you should. You just need to remember, diverse characters don't need a reason to exist. They just do. So if it's what's selling and you're not called to write about it, don't. If you believe you should and you're not called to do it, don't. Even if the publishing house you're working with says, we want more diversity in our writing, that's great. But if that's not what God's called you to, don't. Because if he's called you to put diversity in your writing, it's hard work. It's a lot of hard work. And the whole reason we're here today is you've got to employ sensitivity readers. You've got to. It's not optional if you're writing about a diverse minority group. There is no, I can't even give you wiggle room. You have to employ a sensitivity reader. And again, I can't emphasize enough, they are worth, okay, this is a cliche, their weight in gold because of what they're doing for you. And they need to be paid. Am I out of time? Okay, so I can keep going?
You can keep going, maybe about 5 more minutes. Then we've got a couple questions and then we'll bring people on and see if anyone else has anything they want to
Okay.
ask. Yeah, this is
perfect.
Great information.
Because like I said, Johnny, I can talk about this all day long.
Careful.
So because I wanted to wrap that part up again, you know, when people are writing, they're like, wait, what was point 3? I'm gonna say them again. Okay. Number 1, research before you start. Number 2, describe and carefully name your characters. 3, don't use food to describe skin tone. And that even goes for any skin tone. If I'm writing about someone who is white, I'm not going to say they look like vanilla ice cream. I mean, that's wrong across the board. I have to show, not tell. Number 4, you have to show representation well, and that's bringing in part of that culture. Mm-hmm. Number 5, read, read, read. Read work by authors from that community, not work by authors who are only writing about that community. And number 6, never include a character because it's what's selling or because you believe you should. because diverse characters don't need a reason to exist. They just do. And 7, employ a sensitivity reader. I have one point I want to leave you with. Remember, a lot of times they say the last thing the person says is the most important. If your story was the only one people read about a marginalized community, what kind of impact would you leave on that community and your writing legacy? If your story were the only one people read about a marginalized community, what kind of impact would you leave on the community and your writing legacy? So I'm going to close with that. I can't thank you enough for having me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Now, I know there's some questions,
Yeah.
Okay.
and I'm sure Johnny is probably going to ask them, but before we get to those, there's one question I'd like to ask you, and that's, is it possible for a sensitivity reader to be oversensitive?
Yes. And that's why you kind of get to decide, because it's a communication, which is the most important part. A sensitivity reader may go, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And you might say, okay, but let me explain why I did Z. So it could go either way. Yes, they could. But if you're not communicating, it's not going to help either one of you.
So how can you kind of ferret out the difference between a proper sensitivity read and oversensitive?
Oh, good question.
That's an excellent question. How well do you know the community you're writing about? Because you can't just leave it all up to the sensitivity reader. Your knowledge is going to help. I give the example of, I was helping someone, I was editing for a sensitivity read, and there was something described in there about a maid who was ethnic. And I actually asked a question, why do you feel this is important? And when she explained it to me, I was like, then leave it. Because I'd initially changed it. And she was like, oh, I don't know if I want this. And so then I asked, why is it important? So open communication is key. The only person who can decide if you feel like it's been over read, I'll say, for sensitivity, is you. You're the only person who can decide that. But at the same time, seriously consider what they're saying and why.
Yeah, so it's important to be really open to what they're saying and not just shoot down everything. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And like I said, communication is key. If you're not talking about it, you don't have to take everything they say. But if there's something you question, that's when you really have to have the conversations. Hope that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Questions. One was about, we know that there are people who are going to take offense no matter what. I mean, on all sides of the political spectrum, and we're not getting into politics here, but people just do. And so one question was, how do you respond with humility and respect when you're just being unreasonably slammed for something that you said or wrote about?
Is this something that they felt slammed by the reader?
I don't know, because I'm just going by the question and it's not specific.
That was me, and I'm not speaking of any specific experience of my own, but about 100 things I've read online or heard from other people.
Could you ask me the question again?
Okay. You want me to put on my video?
Yeah.
Either way.
Yeah, you can come back on if you want to.
I have seen a lot of politics, yes, but there are people who seem to make a habit of wanting to feel like an oppressed victim and looking for examples that shows the world is against them and anyone who does not agree with them 100%. So if someone accuses you of insensitivity in one particular point that you think is irrelevant and they're just looking to pick a fight, what do you do while staying humble and loving?
honestly, Catherine, you have to kind of agree to disagree. If it's in real life, that's what I would say. If you're saying something because really out of ignorance and the person takes offense, you can just say, I didn't know. If it's in writing, that's where the communication is so important. We're living in a time of people who are hurting across the world. And honestly, I think, I'm going to point back to George Floyd. What happened wasn't one incident. It was the final straw on a very explosive haystack. And what started happening was people were saying, African Americans, I want to be treated like a person. I want you to see me. Not only as a person, I want to see my children see themselves in their writing. And that's with all marginalized communities. So if you feel like someone is just picking a fight with you, what you're actually seeing is their pain. And that's how they're expressing it. If you've said something and the person says that offended me, then you actually can simply say, I didn't realize it. Does that help?
Yes, and one other question or rather statement, I would assume that also applies to majority people who are hurting because they feel everyone's trying to make them the villain and blame them for everything that ever went wrong. And I would say that those of us who are here, who represent any number of minority groups in one way or another, have to also learn to try to see from the other party's point of view and remember they're all human with human needs and children of God, not simply unfeeling monsters who exist to make our lives miserable.
Yes, there's 3 points that I say to that. The first one is we have to talk. The second one is we have to extend grace. And the third one is we have to act on the information we're given. And talk, is being very vulnerable and very open. But if all parties involved do not extend grace, it's going to end there. But we can't end with talk. We can't end with showing grace. It's now, what are you going to do with the information you have? So everybody across the board, all ethnicities, Black and white, everybody, there's pain. And if we don't talk, if we don't show grace, if we don't then take what we have and act on it, we're not going to see change. Johnny, you're saying something?
I was muted. I thought I wasn't. We're getting amens and definitely's in the comments. So thank you for that. That's healing just to hear you say that. On a lighter topic, a lighter question was the special needs communities, and Brandy, I know, has a special needs child, and so do a couple other people in our group here today. And wondering, like, if they wanted to become a sensitivity reader, the question was, do you advertise for that? Because that's also a marginalized community. And actually, I would, Brandy can speak better to that than I can, and maybe address that question or ask that question in a better way than I did.
You think you did well.
Okay. Brandy, you can advertise. The other thing is, if you send me your information, I will put you on a list with my sensitivity readers. And when someone reaches out who speaks to your situation, I would connect you. So you can advertise, especially being a writer. But because there's so many people out there who are now doing this, if you're going to advertise, I would start with a writing group and help ask them to get the word out that you're available to do this. But I would love to have you on my team.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. Sorry, Brandy, go ahead.
That's all right. It's kind of related to, well, it is related to special needs. So if you're in a sensitivity group, and so you're sensitive to that particular group, but you write a story that perhaps others in your sensitivity group might be offended by, I'm guessing it's probably wise to double check with other members of your community and say, hey, would this bother you if this scenario was in this story? Is that a good idea?
Yes, because they're in your community.
Mm.
And in a way, you're getting their input as a sensitivity reader. They're an expert in what you're doing. And so, yes, I would get their input. And then if you're working with a different sensitivity reader, and they ask you to change something, you can come back and say, well, I did some research here, and this is what I found out, and this is why I want to use this. Again, communication.
So it's entirely possible that you can read for sensitivity in your own community, but might need the help of other members because perhaps there are things beyond your own sensitivity that might not go over well in your own community. You don't want to alienate your own community, right?
Bingo. And the reason for a sensitivity reader is they should not get offended. This is a learning time. They should not get offended. So yes, that's always use, you have that main sensitivity reader, use beta readers as well. I strongly encourage this last job I did to get a beta reader because there were parts in it that I couldn't speak to. And I was honest. I said, I've addressed all the issues you asked me to, but as I've read about this other character, I'm not sure what you have will work. Get a beta reader. So don't just settle with one input from a sensitivity reader. You get as much as you can. And when you know you have done all you could, you've researched, you've gotten readers, you've gotten beta readers, then you just have to trust God and let it go.
Yeah.
Someone is always going to be offended. Someone is always not going to like what you write. But between you and God, and you know that you've done the best you can, and you know that he's called you to do this, then you have to let it go. I mean, remember, Jesus wasn't that popular and he had a lot to say, but he trusted the Father and he went about what he was supposed to do. That's the same as writers.
Norma, you had said you had a question.
I do. I had a gal in one of the writing groups I'm a part of, critique groups. She said that she wasn't going to make her characters specific nationalities or ethnicities. She was going to leave that up to the reader to decide. What would you say to somebody with that thought?
Characters are not cookie cutters. They need depth. They need to be 3D. If you're going to leave it to the writer, then the message is going to get watered down. It's going to be stronger if the characters are invested because of who they are, because of their backgrounds. I honestly think this person may not have a strong following of their story because she's going to leave it open. It's going to be interpreted differently by everyone, and it might not be the message she wants to come across. So I'd encourage her, give them depth, give them, I mean, if you've got names that can go across the board, we don't know if we're talking about a guy or a girl. And the other thing is, and you know this as readers, in order to connect with your characters early on, you need to have something to connect to. Mm-hmm. If I'm reading a story and I have in my mind, I'm reading about a 22-year-old and chapter 6, I find out they're 45, I'm going to feel betrayed. I'm going to be like, well, you know, all this time I've been thinking that this person was 22 and that's why they act this way. And now you're telling me they're 45. So they need to give their readers something to connect with their characters.
That's like even true. Have you ever read, like I read this historical once and it starts out with this boy, you know, doing these things. And then you find out like maybe 20 pages in, it's really a girl disguised as a boy for whatever reason. I had to go back and start over because I had to read it through that perspective. It's and it
Right.
was, you know, a fun historical romance by an author I really liked, but it's like, I don't know, I didn't like that because I had to start over and read it that way again.
And some people, Johnny, wouldn't do what you did. They would get so frustrated. They'd be like, toss that book.
I believe Sophia has a question.
Oh, well, you guys can come on, and then Sophia, I'm sorry, I didn't even see your little hand up there, but go ahead and ask your question. Anyone else that wants to come on, please do. If you were put in writer's chat jail and cannot get on, say something in the chat and we will bring you on.
Hi, Edwina. I'm really thankful that you're here. I write fantasy, which is its own beast. But I have the antagonists are descendants from Earth. The protagonists are the indigenous people of a water-covered planet. And I just took the colors of fish because I love how beautiful and how varied that is. And they're like green and red and all these other colors, and they're very cool. And then the antagonists are representative of various ethnicities from Earth. And I had a meeting with a representative who is no longer with Tor, and she was Asian, and she gave me great, awesome, encouraging feedback over email. And then when I had my meeting with her, after I sat down, I started sensing hostility suddenly. And then she was, and the thing is, I pulled, and I don't know why I did it. It just felt right to me. I just felt like I'm going to check out Yoruba. I'm from New York, so I've got friends of lots of ethnicities, and now I'm in the South, and I have a lot. There are less ethnicities down in the South. There are usually only two, but I would say a good half of my friends are African American. So I have a good sense of differences. I mean, I can peg someone from Nigeria from the way they speak and from where they look, because I have a number of friends that are that way. And I thought, I'm going to go with Yoruba for a base language to build some flavor for my indigenous people. And so I would use words like Baba and Iya and stuff like that for mother and father instead of mom and pop. I felt like it gave it a better taste of not being milquetoast, whatever. But the woman there was very offended that I had allowed the antagonists, who this particular antagonist is more of a Native American coloration and background, and that I had used him to suppress and take captive the people that were coming up from the water to figure out why their planet had been terraformed. I know I'm throwing weirdness at you. And she was really offended, like, why would you do that? And I was like, and it was hard because I was like, people have the ability to do good or evil, no matter what their background, no matter what their experience. Some will use their experience to be more sympathetic. Some will use their experience to pass it down. And and it was hard because also I am very white passing, but I'm first generation Korean. So my mom is Korean. So I was raised in that kind of mixed household where I don't look at it all, but I wash my meat. My daughter says, you know what? None of my friends do this. Only you do this. But I do things that are characteristic of people who were not born in this country. And I really felt hurt and jumped on, but I don't know how much I have to explain. Hey, listen, you've probably had roots in this country more than I do, and you probably haven't experienced the discrimination from both sides of the family that I have, being part of a mixed race family. Both sides rejected my parents' marriage, and therefore I had a little relationship with any of my grandparents. And I was like, I can speak to this, but how do you defend yourself without being overly defensive? Mostly I just let them have their say and I'll just go off and find somebody else to hang with. But as an author,
Okay. That last statement solved it.
okay.
It really did, because if you feel like, see, that's the thing. If a sensitivity reader is offended, and they're not giving you positive feedback, you need to find someone who understands what you're trying to do. And that doesn't mean you're going to jump ship on every person. But the idea of a good sensitivity reader is that they're going to give you feedback to help your writing, not just criticize you. There's a difference between criticizing and critiquing. And from what you've explained, you were definitely criticized. And you are part of this community that it sounds like you're writing about. You have experienced the hurt and the hardship. The main thing I would say is be consistent with your writing. And fantasy. You have so much leeway with fantasy. And you want to know what's really funny? I have a fantasy sensitivity reader.
Oh.
Which, when she told me she read for sensitivity in fantasy, I'm like, how do you do that? She's like, I've got it down. And she's published a number of fantasy books. But yeah, that's where, if you find yourself in a situation where you're having to defend, that's not a good reader sensitivity relationship or writer sensitivity relationship. The whole idea, it's for learning. It's for growth, because more is happening than what's on the page. And that from what you described was toxic.
It was.
And had I been in your shoes, I would have just said thank you and moved on.
Because I mean, I have friends who are, I'm thinking, I know fantasy authors who are African American who write fantasy, and I've read several of her books and I've interacted with her. She writes about pirate nuns. She's awesome. But, and then I've got my story out with my friends, and half of them are African American. So I'm not like, I want to know. I'm like, what is it like when your hair gets wet? If you were sea dwelling and you had curly hair, what would it be like? How would it react when it came out? Would you use oils in the ocean, or would you not have to? What was it like when you went to the beach? And I have friendships that can bear those questions. And, it's not the first question I ask. It's, after we've been hanging for a while, I want to know about this. So
well, and you did say something that did, perk my interest a little bit, that you had a character that was kind of based on Native Americans.
Yeah, he's one of my antagonists. He's actually the main antagonist, because the people in the water, they have various skin tones within themselves. They might be green and blue or orange and black or whatever. The invaders are noticed because they stand out because they only have one skin tone. Right. It might be a dark reddish brown. It might be a very pale complexion. It might be brown, smooth skin, but it's one color, and that's odd to the water people.
Okay, the one thing I would say is, if you've got a fantasy character that has deeper roots into someone who's more real, like a Native American, that's where you need to have someone read it a little bit, so that you're not coming across as stereotypical, even though you've got fantasy. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, that was a really good wrap up and specific, and really kind of put this together almost like you guys had planned. Thank you, Sophia, for bringing that up and giving us that real life example, and Edwina for your responses to what she was experiencing. That that was tremendous to kind of put this all together. So I'm going to close up the recording and this episode, but stay on for the after party. And Edwina, you're invited to stay on as long as you're able. We appreciate your time, and we have gone over, but this is such an important topic, and we're just very thankful for what you shared with us today. It's just been terrific and a wonderful learning experience. Next week, I get to do all the talking. I'm going to be doing not really, you guys have to pop in and chime in. I'm going to be doing how to write a romance. Our Tuesday's the 15th is the day after Valentine's Day, but that's what we're going to do anyway. We're going to keep Valentine's going a whole week, I guess, and just give you some basics on if you want to write a romance, what some of the it's not a formula, but there are reader expectations, and you need to know what those are and about how to get started in that. So I'm really excited about it and hope you'll join us for that. The week after that, we'll be going back to talking about conference prep. So we've talked about, before the conference, we're going to be talking about at the conference, etiquette, all those kinds of fun things. And once you've decided where you're going to go. So we're excited to have you here. Thank you. If you're watching us on the replay, please feel free to join our Writers Chat Facebook group. Check out our Writers Chat page where we put all of our episodes, so you can scroll through that and see which ones you're interested in. And of course, they're all on YouTube. So Edwina, thank you once again. Thank you so much for this. It's very needed and very wonderful. And thanks everybody for being here. And we'll see you next week on Writers Chat. Bye-bye.
Bye.